Good evening. Fairy, Lore and Landscape is an exhibition curated by Dr Jenny Butler, currently on display at the Boole Library in University College Cork. On tonight's show, I spend an hour with Dr Butler at the exhibition, and we start the conversation by crossing the Bluebell threshold.
Let's have a little chat about that as we move around, but I'm really interested to see that we've passed over a Bluebell sort of threshold and we've come through the portal into the exhibition, and I think we have to go around clockwise really, because that's the traditional way, right? We have to follow the sun. So can we walk around the exhibit?
The Bluebells, just to mention that apparently anyway from what I've read, they're the Bluebells native to Ireland and Britain. There is other varieties like a Spanish bluebell, but a lot of the stories again about place would be bluebells in forests in this part of the world. And there's a legend that if you hear a bell ringing, you know that there's this invisible bell in the bluebell, that's a death omen. So there's they're very pretty and nice, but there's also some sinister associations, or that you could be more easily led astray, in a forest with bluebells. Again, particular plants and trees being associated with these otherworldly influences. So
okay, so if I see, one of my favourite places locally is Ballyannon Woods in Middleton, which is like bluebell heaven, right? But the way you're describing it, I should be a little bit more careful when I walk through it. Especially
at dawn or dusk, so times of transition. And you'll see with the colours here, I was trying to get a twilight, with...
Well, let's describe what we see, because I'll have a go first, right? So there's panels on the wall, right? And the wall is white, right? And at the bottom of the wall we have a kind of a meadow to my eyes, right? And I see dragonflies and I see butterflies and I see some liberty caps, some mushrooms, yeah? And I see a fly agaric coming out of the wall, large scale, big enough to sit on or possibly collapse on top of. And then there's panels on the wall, and like you say, the colour of the panel is a deep purple, the dark side of purple, and then there's a beautifully fonted description with photographs on each of the panels, yeah? Can we go over and stand in front of the panel? So did I get that right?
Yes. So the colour, at first impression, it might seem quite twee, and the font choice. So that's also intentional. And there's a pink light in here as well that's lighting up the mushroom. And so it's about the perception, and the also referencing the idea that these are somehow this kind of whimsical idea of fairies, but it's also kind of pointing to the belief and all of those stories around fairies being able to present themselves one way, but being something else behind that. So what's called a glamour, or having not superficial, but having one kind of layer of what you present, but being the reality behind it is different. So this is all this comes into people's experiences of being kind of quite taken by something like music, very beautiful music, or something, some vision or something beautiful that they see that they're very drawn to, and they're kind of led astray by that. They're drawn into something where they're then captured by the fairies, or they end up in the other world without really knowing what's happening to them. So
there's an element of enchantment going on here, and there's an element of disguise and mask and luring people into an experience unwillingly, or at least on a superficial level, unwilling to go through the experience. Is that what you've been picking up?
Yeah, so it's not... there's no hard and fast rule. It's not a bad thing. So people have good experiences, but people have also had negative experiences, and there's a huge cultural fear of being taken away by the fairies or being trapped in the other world, about children being taken away. So the Stolen Child, the George Russell painting that's on the central panel, matches the Yeats poem of the same name. So that's presented quite beautifully, a little child and these tall figures. So the she, or the Tuatha Danann, which is the people of the goddess Anu in the mythology, the old religion. So are sometimes described as being tall, noble people, Nadina Uashla, noble people. And the image, again, is kind of blues and purples, and it's in a meadow, and it seems very calm, and there's a niceness to it. But when you read Yeats's poem, it's presenting this other beautiful place that seems lovely and a very positive thing. But it's called the stolen child. So someone's being stolen away. Yeah. So there's more than one thing going on.
For sure. And the painting is gorgeous. The George Russell painting, and the child. And it's hard to tell if it's a boy or a girl child because the child's wearing a smock, and that was the fashion of the time.
But it was sorry to it was the fashion, but it was also some say anyway that it was done to protect boys, to dress them like girls so that they wouldn't be taken away by the fairies, because boys in stories at least are favoured by the fairies, male infants, and that's been analysed in different ways, including the kind of medical analysis that the symptoms of the changeling, or the fairy that replaces the human child, that this matches up with some congenital birth defects that were more common in boys. So there's lots of different ways of analysing these things as well.
Let's go down that rabbit hole another day, Jenny. But just on the painting, there's three figures in the centre, which presumably are the Tuatha Danann, or the otherworldly characters. Do you know if George Russell intended them to represent any particular deities in the native mythology, or is it just? Or why did he pick three? Any ideas, insights?
I'm not too sure actually, but
we just have to channel the man and ask him, won't we?
In mythological tradition, in folklore, three is quite significant. There's often three aspects of one deity, or three deities together, or even in fairy tales, which are different.
Give me three wishes, eh? And the triple spiral and so on is a big part of our shared art.
I'm not sure if he was specifically.
I bet he was, but he's not here. So George, where are you?
So I've been interested in the otherworldly, or what people call supernatural, for a long time, and I'm a specialist on folk religion, but I'm particularly interested in otherworldly beings. So I'm interested in the history of folklore collection as well, and I was kind of looking at the collections of folklore material that relates to fairies, and reading some of the stories in those, and I became aware of the connection between Ireland and Newfoundland in Canada, and I was interested in how legends connected to landscape, particularly to do with otherworldly beings like fairies, how they would change when people emigrated to a new place that had quite a different environment. So in 2009, I went to Newfoundland with a filmmaker, Susanna Zalokar, and we were given a bursary by the Newfoundland-Ireland Partnership to make an ethnographic documentary. So we were initially looking for legends, just people to tell us any stories they knew about places, fairy places, as they're called in Ireland, and to know if the terminology and the kind of places were the same. But we found that people started to tell us about experiences they'd had, so first-hand accounts, or that these weren't legends from the past even, they were quite current. It was something that actually happened to somebody they knew, and so it took a different turn.
And that's kind of interesting, because there's one thing about data processing, and we all get information data and we process it and we share it with the academic who comes to ask us stuff, and that's of interest. But when I have my own experience and I can share that with you, that's a different level of engagement with the subject matter.
Yeah, and it's quite a sensitive thing as well. You know, it's sometimes can be a big deal for someone to share those kinds of experiences.
Well, we're not supposed to accept the existence of the other world in our crazy globalised world.
Yeah, exactly. So sometimes there's a bit of wariness, understandably, around somebody collecting this kind of material, because you don't know what they're going to do with it. You don't know until you know that. I suppose that's part of doing ethnography, about meeting people and interviewing them and putting them at ease about what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Because we're in a university right now, Jenny, right? And I guess in the whole world of the university, the amount of people that would take the work you're doing seriously is probably quite small. I mean, we're not talking about cutting-edge technology that we can make a profit out of.
No, but we're talking about culture and identity and the environment we live in and what it means. Some people, they'll say these things are all in the past, or, as you said, people think it's not real or it's not important, but it is. It's very much there under the surface. People say that these things maybe belong to the past, or only old people know about them, but that's not the case when you actually start to talk to people.
Yes.
Lots of people have had experiences, and more people. I think once you open up these things and people start to talk about it, you find that people, even if they haven't had experiences themselves, they know of someone, or they've at least, they're aware of the type of thing it is.
Okay. And what kind of experiences are people sharing with you, or were people sharing with you specifically on that trip in Newfoundland? And were they similar to the sort of experiences people in Ireland were sharing with you?
Well, there are many similarities about the type of place, like the spaces that you'd encounter fairies in, like forests. So there's a strong association with trees, both in Ireland and Newfoundland. In Ireland, people are, well, you'd hear quite a lot about fairy trees, so I didn't hear that so much in Newfoundland. But the hawthorn specifically in Ireland is known as a fairy tree, and that it shouldn't be, disrespected or interfered with, or the branches broken from it or brought into the house. So these things have regional variation, but in most places it's known as a fairy tree.
So the Irish in Newfoundland, they gave you a big welcome. You listened to them talking. Did you hear echoes of home in their tales?
I heard echoes of home in their accents. So it's interesting. It's kind of, some of the things I was told were like an answer or a continuation of things that I already knew that weren't in the stories I'd heard from here. Interesting parallels that were also different, which is what I was looking for. So one of the things that's different is the fish flake, which is just a structure for drying fish. So it's up off the ground, and there's a dark space underneath the platform for drying the fish, and that space is associated with the fairies, that they hide in there because they don't want to be seen by human beings, and that's also something that's found in Irish tradition and Icelandic with the hidden people. Maybe they intentionally don't want to be seen by humans or talked about, so that's why we have these euphemistic ways, like the other crowd, the little people, the noble people, and so on. I've been safe enough so far. I'm always talking about them, but it's. I hope I'm doing that in a respectful way, and out of interest. So,
just on that, if people are unsure about their own personal safety, are there things they can do to protect themselves apart from changing their attitude? But are there things we can do to protect ourselves if we go into the the mushroom ring or the rath?
So in Ireland and in Newfoundland, for example, one of the things, if you find or you think you're being led astray, or you start to get confused, you can turn your coat inside out. So there's lots of themes of inversion, like that the fairies are somehow controlling your perception, or maybe changing the landscape or your experience of it. So by taking your coat, which is yours, and turning it around, it maybe confuses them, or it's like a counter charm. And in the Irish tradition, which is maybe mentioned less now than the turning your coat inside out, is to put nails, like iron nails, in your pocket when you're going out walking, or especially if you're going into an unfamiliar landscape, so you don't get turned around, as it's called, or led astray. And there are, again, many different theories about the metal, particularly iron, that fairies are supposed to fear, or that this is used as a kind of a protection against them, like the fear of babies and toddlers being taken away. That was often avoided, or things were used to ward off the fairies, like a metal spade, which is also, traditionally a man's implement on the farm, or something from the kitchen that's metal, or a poker from the fire. So fire is also a protection against otherworldly influences, and there's the whole interpretation of the symbolism of that, or the nature versus culture, so that fairies are maybe part of nature and the natural world, whereas fire is something humans make as part of culture. So there's a dichotomy there. The metal nails in your pocket is quite common. It comes up in many stories and interviews in Ireland, but in Newfoundland, the people more commonly talked about putting bread in their pockets. And people, when I asked about it, people gave lots of different explanations, or what they thought that was being done for. Some people said that if the fairies are trying to take you away, that you throw some bread and that they get distracted by the bread. Other people said they eat the bread, so they're hungry and they want something to eat. One person said that it might be like something like Hansel and Gretel, where you put the bread so you can find your way back along that trail. But it's interesting that in Ireland, at least I hadn't come across this use of bread as a protection against fairies, but I had come across what's known as the hungry grass, which is famine. Like during the famine, so many people were dying, and there was sometimes nowhere to put them, or people just physically couldn't bring them to the graveyard, so they buried them out on the landscape. And those places are known locally, or it's been passed down, but not everybody would know if they're walking across a famine plot. So there's lots of folklore about walking across graves and things that can happen, and again, that's to do with respecting the dead. But the stories go that if someone unintentionally walks across a famine grave, they could get hunger pangs so severe that they could die. So that the kind of counter charm to that is to bring bread in your pocket, so that you're eating something, obviously, and it undoes this association, or this event. So I don't know whether that travelled to Newfoundland and changed into being something about the fairies, or whether they're two different things, but it's just interesting.
but we're after walking over Irish history, right? So you have some of the manifestations of the invasions into Ireland, right? So you've got the Tuatha De Danann, the Fir Bolg, the Fomorians, the Memedians, and like the
Partholonians.
The Partholonians, yeah, and the Miletians. These are Ireland's the waves of invasions in like prehistory that came to us, and you've depicted them on the ground, presumably as a reminder, and also as a cue. But the bright lights as well. Mm-hmm. Were these the bright lights that shone the way for us afterwards?
Again, it's open to interpretation. Light is associated with Tír na nÓg, the land of eternal youth, which is one of the names for this spiritual realm, and it's described as a bright paradise. So we'll never know if the Christian scribes who wrote this material down in medieval times were they literally recording something from the old religion, or were they influenced by the Christian idea of heaven as being a bright paradise? And is the other world of the fairies, is it the same as the world of the dead? I mean, we don't have answers to any of these things. So one of the things was the light, and also there's many connections between fairy beings, or the manifestation of fairies in our realm as lights, and otherworldly associations with orbs as being the souls of the dead, or the souls of babies, unbaptized babies in particular, or as the will-o'-the-wisp, which is lights on the bog, which are associated with fairies, and again being led astray by these lights that move. So there's all kinds of associations with lights, and also with there's overlap as well as many differences between the fairy lore and alien lore, and the kinds of experiences. So sometimes you could read something from the 1800s that, if you pluck it out of the context that you're reading, sounds very like an alien abduction experience that someone might, describe as a UFO, this strange light, or losing time, being drawn away, being confused, not being able to find your way out of a very familiar place, like your own garden or a field that you walk through every day. And these things are also associated with what are called aliens in our contemporary culture. So again, it's about how you frame an experience. Yeah. And there's also some recorded archival descriptions of fairies being grey, that their skin is grey, and you have the greys as a category of alien, little green men, again the green jackets and the red caps, and them being small. So
on one level we could be talking about an ancient archetype that just gets up in the contemporary cultural clothing of the era, say the Rockwell era, if you like, as opposed to the Victorian era.
Yeah, and under your foot there,
I'm walking on the Tuatha De Danann, and I feel cursed already. But no, I'm at peace with the fairy folk. It's all good.
So again, this is referencing that the Tuatha De Danann are under the ground, or that the other world, or the underworld, is in this chthonic realm that's accessible through caves and the forts, these ring forts with souterrains, all of those physical things that are underground, and this concept of the spiritual realm being below us, but it also the Tuatha De Danann as one of these mythic groups that came to Ireland. You have the in folklore they become synonymous with the fairies, but I forget what I was going to say.
That's all right. I know we're in the fairies are messing with your mind.
The Tuatha De Danann, there's you have the records that were already mediated by Christian scribes, so you have two different cosmologies there, two different ways of understanding the world, but the description in Old Irish is translated in different ways. One of the translations is that the Tuatha Dé Danann came in cloud ships, and some people, kind of in a popular level, reinterpret that as being extraterrestrials, that they were coming in a ship and landing, rather than coming across the sea in a ship and then burning the ship to make a magic mist. You have these associations with the fairies and magic mist as well. So again, that's to reference also this mythological account that the sons of Mil, or the Milesians, that they had a battle with the Tuatha Dé Danann, and the Tuatha Dé Danann went into the landscape itself, and that that understanding of fairies as neighbours that live on the same or in the same landscape, that human beings are the descendants of a different mythic people.
And I have a Milesian name, Anna. My name is associated with the Milesian, or at least in the annals, which, as you know, were written long after the Milesians arrived, but it's one of the names that was thrown back onto the Milesians, Anna, from a long time ago. So I've got a link with them lads, and of course we all have a link. We all have a link with the Tuatha Dé Danann.
And you'll see that it's not a timeline. That this isn't a chronology. There's kind of they're more like swirls and spirals and swirls, and places that are pre-Celtic, like Newgrange, which were kind of included in the what we call Celtic mythology. The reference there to more like a spiral, or we don't know for sure.
Well, the spirals is very important.
These were literal invasions, or who they were, or what time period. So that's why they're kind of melding into each other a little bit.
Yeah, they may refer to developments in consciousness, or developments in technology, or developments in engineering, or whatever. But we don't know, right? Which you keep coming back to. Speak about what you know.
You're listening to the Artefact show on Community Radio Youghal with Anna Dowling. Tonight I'm spending an hour in the Boole Library of University College Cork with Dr Jenny Butler, and we'll continue our conversation after the break. You're very welcome back to Artefact on Community Radio Youghal with Anna Dowling. Recently I spent an hour at the Fairy Lore and Landscape exhibition in University College Cork. I was given a personal guided tour of the exhibit by the curator, Dr Jenny Butler.
One of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, Jenny, is because it's lore and landscape, right? And it's written right up there at the very top, fairy lore and landscapes, plural, right? So it's the idea of the fairies, the lore about the fairies, but being embedded in the actual landscape. And that's of interest to me. Can you talk to me a bit about that, some of the basics of that?
So whether you're talking about belief or worldview, the way of seeing the world, or cosmology, the way people have of understanding their place in the world, whether that's religious or not, how people understand themselves and their environment, all of that is connected to place. From place names to things that are physically there in the landscape, all of that is interconnected with stories and beliefs and attitudes and things that are customary to do, and what we might say, kind of on in an analytical way, as intangible cultural heritage. Those things that you can't touch, but are out there and that are in people's knowledge. They're part of like cultural knowing, of memory. And all of those things impact on how people, how they go about their everyday lives. It can be a very subtle way, but it's something that's it's imperceptible until you ask about it, because it's in people's minds.
Yeah.
But when you do, you can see those connections to the landscape.
Okay. And just for beginners, right? I've got my L plates on. I'm walking into the fairy world with my L plates on. If I went looking for a fairy, what kind of landscape would I be looking for?
Well,
or are they everywhere?
Well, if you read some of Lady Augusta Gregory or William Butler Yeats, some of their collections, there's the belief and the idea that fairies are everywhere, that they're in the air, and that they're all around, but they're hidden. So you have phrases like the other crowd, or the in Iceland more overtly the hidden people, that they're hidden from normal human sight, or that only particular people can see them or perceive them. And there's other descriptions there as well, like Yeats talked about the trooping fairies, or the idea of a collective that's physically moving across the landscape. So some of the places would be the mounds, the ring forts, which are archaeological remains of habitations that were human made. So there's all kinds of interpretations and different theories on why they're connected to the fairies. And there are particular trees like the hawthorn. So quite a few of the pictures here are of different hawthorn trees. And the hawthorn blooms in May. So the tree itself is kind of locally called the May in some parts of Ireland, and May Day and May time is particularly associated with the fairies as a time when they move from one place to another.
Fairies migrate.
Well, that's one suggestion, that they are following routes almost like animals would from place to place, or that they are behaving like humans, at least traditionally did, moving their cattle to other pastures, or maybe going to a summer house or something like that.
Yeah,
so
it sounds like an echo of a nomadic ancestral way of life, where you'd followed the seasons to the food sources, you'd followed the rivers or the old paths through the woods, and you reckon the fairies are still doing that?
That's one theory, that it's a memory of, or a way, like a coded way of talking about ancient people that are not there anymore, but that's how they're remembered, like as being in the same landscape. Or I suppose a more spiritual way of explaining it is that there is a spiritual realm that's somehow interconnected with what we perceive as our natural landscape, and at certain points on that, like particular trees or these forts, caves, that these are somehow entranceways, or to use a more modern term, like some kind of portal into this otherworldly realm. So
it's very interesting, because spirituality is a big word. The more I talk to you, Jenny, the more I realise how big words are. They all spin off in many directions, but spirituality means something different to everybody again, right? But for some people, spirituality refers to recognising the spirit in every living thing, as if it has a spirit, or possibly a diva or a fairy that lives in that tree or that flower or that thing. Have you come across people telling you about that?
Yes, I research new religious movements, including contemporary paganism, and there's the whole spectrum of different beliefs and understandings when it comes to fairies among pagans, and different types of paganism. You've Wicca, which is a form of pagan witchcraft, Druidry, contemporary shamanism, and so on. So in general, in terms of like the history of the pagan movement, it was influenced by things like theosophy, so this philosophical and spiritual system. I have referenced Madame Helena Blavatsky, and she wrote about who was a founder of theosophy. She wrote about elementals as kind of as spiritual beings, and she wrote about different planes of existence. So that's influenced different new religious movements and their understandings of what fairies are. For example, in some Druid groups or groves, so a grove of trees, that's used as the name for the ritual group. I've taken part in rituals where the quarters, like a magic circle, is cast. So cast is a technical term, and it can be marked out physically on the ground or visualized as an energetic space, and the compass points, or the four quarters, are called. So different deities and different spiritual beings are associated with different directions. And sometimes for certain groups that I've taken part in ritual with, they've invoked or called upon the fairies to take part in the ritual. So that's quite different. I think that's influenced by ideas of genie loci, of spirits of place, and also of elementals as being associated with particular directions and magical symbols. So there are differences in the things that were traditionally collected by people like Yeats and Lady Gregory and so on, and what we call the antiquarian folklore collections further back in time, and what different new religious movements, different cultural groups are doing and thinking about today in relation to fairies. There are other influences coming in, and also the Victorian fascination with the spirit world. So you had the development of spiritualism, people having seances, and you had people being fascinated with both the dead and with fairies. So one of the theories, so we can only talk about theories, nobody knows what fairies are, how these things originated, or even what people believed in the past. So we're only relying on stories really that have been passed down, and which have changed as well through time. But just to mention that it's been suggested that perhaps the Sidhe were or are the dead. The human ancestors, that it was some kind of a veneration of ancestors, similar to in other indigenous traditions around the world, in parts of Africa and Asia and so on. There are many interpretations.
Can I ask you about the particular experience you shared with me about being in that grove and casting that space and calling in the fairies? Just two simple questions. What did it sound like, and what did it feel like at that moment?
Well, what it sounded like in the ritual setting, people would, in that particular case, there was a high druid, and he called the quarters by verbally saying words and verbally calling on the fairies to come in, and he drew in the air with his finger a circle, like a portal for the fairies to come through should they wish to take part. And it felt it's hard to describe actually. It felt quite still and quite calm. And of course I was waiting to see if I could see or perceive anything.
Must have been a bit of adrenaline in the circle.
Yeah, and for some people that feeling is understood as magic, as the energy coming either through people or from spirits or deities, or from the land itself. And the purpose of that particular ritual was to gather the energy in this sacred space, this circle, and then to send it out for healing. And that ritual was to do with the hill. This is going back many years. It was to do with protecting the hill of Tara from destruction. So unfortunately that wasn't successful in that damage was done to the site. But
And we're talking about the Tarascrine Valley and the building of the motorway. And there was a huge mobilisation of interested people from all sorts of life, environmentalists, people interested in the occult, people interested in archaeology. And did they win, did they not? Who knows? Because, you can say they didn't. But at the same time, the archaeology that was discovered there has greatly added to our collective knowledge of our past.
It has, but once a site has been destroyed, it can't be brought back. And again, this is to do with wider kind of frameworks of meaning around religion and what's sacred, because the church, there is a church on the Hill of Tara. It's a deconsecrated church, but if it was an active church and somebody wanted to bulldoze that church and there was a campaign to stop it, I think there would be quite a different reaction to a mound that a particular group or different groups of people for different reasons regard as special, or whether that's a sacred site for them or whether it's some cultural and historical heritage significance. Again, there's a whole spectrum of understandings of it, but that's still quite different in terms of how it's perceived in the general population and in the media. So you have a different, you have often phrases like tree-hugging hippies, or kind of a dismissive attitude towards people making a claim to sacrality when it's out in the landscape like that, or where it's not part of an organised religion. So you have fairy rings and you have ring forts. So the ring fort, or the colloquial name fairy fort, is understood as the habitation of fairies, or some kind of entranceway to the other world. So you have stories like someone falls asleep on a ring fort and they wake up in the other world with the fairies. But you also have fairy rings, which are rings of mushroom. So the fungus just grows like this, and it's connected under the ground by mycelium, and these are known as the fairies' dancing ground. So there's quite funny and nice descriptions of people seeing fairies dancing and playing music and partying, and there's other more sinister accounts of people being accidentally walking on them and being stolen away, or being pulled into a fairy ring and being trapped and having to keep dancing or something, and so in the exhibition it's interesting, some people avoid it and others walk straight into it, like you did.
I walk straight into it. I do that a lot. Boom boom. Right, that's really interesting. And have you heard the fairy music yourself, Jenny?
I've heard about fairy tunes that were given to people by the fairies, but I haven't heard any music myself, not yet anyway.
Well, maybe we will. Jenny, I'm very conscious of taking up all your time, right? But I'm not sure how much time we have left, but we have to talk about this. And I'm pointing at, what is it made out of? Is it foam?
It's a styrofoam painted.
It's a gorgeous big painted styrofoam mushroom, right? So
this was made by William Ruan, who works here in the library, who's an artist. So this is, I think, a fantastic edition. So the exhibition is a collaboration between myself and Cronan O'Devlin, head of special collections in the library, who organised all the books on display, and also had input into the ideas behind what we do with the exhibition. And William Ruan made this sculpture.
And well done, William, and I hope you had loads of fun making it, William, and I hope you went out to the woods and tried to find a real life specimen. This is what we know as a fly agaric, right? It's a psychedelic fungus, right? Psychedelic mushroom, and it's positioned coming out of the wall just over a representation, a silhouette of what to my eye looked like liberty caps, right? Which is the indigenous psilocybin mushroom as well. So the question becomes, Jenny, the role of the hallucinogenic experience in the development of the fairy lore.
So again, it comes down for me to how things are framed. So you have lots of references both in stories and in things like fantasy art to toadstools and mushrooms and little creatures being under them, and all of those kinds of ideas of enchantment, and but in I think a more maybe a more I don't know the word, like a positive kind of depiction, and then you have like we don't know in the Irish context whether people used in former times, going back to ancient Ireland, whether they used entheogens. So entheogen is a ritual substance that people take to change their perception in order to communicate with deities or spirits or ancestors, and that word is used because, again, the other words that people use have all of their cultural baggage, like hallucinogen suggests that's coming from psychiatry and psychology. It suggests someone is hallucinating, that what they're seeing isn't real, or that it's some kind of aberration, that they're psychotic, this kind of disconnected from reality. Whereas an entheogen, it's connecting to another reality, or something that some part of reality we don't normally perceive. So it's about perception and just changing that to enable other kinds of communication. So similarly, you have the word psychedelic. So that's coming from 60s counterculture and things that were written at that time, which also suggests kind of deviance maybe, or again something that's recreational. So it's again, like, I think each of these words influences how somebody understands an experience, and how the wider culture will view something as well. So the reference, the fly agaric, so it's poisonous to flies, that's why it's called fly agaric, protruding out. It's a bit like the hawthorn trees. They're quite craggy and protruding into the landscape. So that it's like they're a connection between both worlds in their shape and in the colour as well. So fairies, both in different parts of Britain, you have the red caps, and in some of the interviews that I did in Newfoundland, people talked about fairies as red caps. So that they're
that they wear red caps.
That they either some people say that their bodies themselves are different colours, or that they wear green coats and red hats.
Sort of like gnomes and leprechauns territory.
Yeah, so you have all of these other categorizations of beings as well, and you might notice I don't have the word leprechaun in the exhibition.
You've spoken it now.
So again, like, partly because of how the material was collected in Ireland, and also the language issue between the Irish and the English, lots of different spiritual beings are called fairies. So Anslua She, you have the sometimes deities being described as fairies as well, the banshee, leprechauns, and the puka as well, shape-shifting being, and it's also the word for a ghost. So again, there's many different interpretations, but the leprechaun to me is something a bit different to these beings that are connected with the landscape. The leprechaun is usually described as being in the house. it's lucky to catch a leprechaun. They're usually male. He grants wishes. He knows where the crock of gold is. It's not really lucky to catch a member of the Sidhe, or advised, in the general.
Would that work against me if I was to capture a member of the Sidhe?
Well, it's disrespectful. I mean, if
Why would you want
these as deities or as at least powerful beings, it's maybe not a good idea.
If you love a fairy, set them free, right? That's interesting. And just on that, I want to bring you down to ground level, if I may, because we have a little thing on the ground here, right?
Yeah.
And it's something that I see more and more in toy shops, right? And I see more and more when I go to visit the forest as well. And it's the wee little fairy door, right? This is a spectacularly beautiful one. It's very glittery. It's got the same kind of colour as you have on the panels, that kind of, is it a violet, almost an indigo? But it's kind of glittered up, and it's the fairy door. It's a portal for the little people. Why have you included this in the exhibition?
It was interesting because as soon as the exhibition had opened, somebody who'd come in to have a look at it had this fairy door at home and really wanted to put it in the exhibition. So, and I like that because this is, there's a fairy door company. This is merchandise and it's marketed to children. But at the same time, it is connected to the traditions that are there of places that are portals, or these connection points between our world, our everyday reality, and this other world. And you can look at that in different ways, about perception or about physically going, into the underworld through a cave, or falling asleep and waking up in the other world. Is it a dream world? Is it the afterlife? Is it a shift in our perception, that we're just perceiving the same landscape around us but in a different way? What does it mean? So I liked that it's a more explicit reference, and I like that it's something children might notice. So if a child is in here, they tend to, because they're smaller, they'll notice something maybe that an adult wouldn't, or it's glittery, and it's a literal door. So I think it ties in with the other references that are being made.
Okay, well, I love the idea that it was a gift. That's the first thing I really like about that, and that you accepted the gift, because that's part of the culture too. Are there any concerns about people sticking fairy doors that are manufactured in factories into the actual landscape where fairies may or may not live? I mean, should we be putting portals in our beloved forests?
Well, there are traditions of sticking things into trees, like coins, for example. I don't know how much damage that does to a tree. Personally, I'm not a fan of leaving artificial things in nature, but at the same time it's a big part of folk religion, tying rags and ribbons to trees, whether that's for the fairies or for a saint. Leaving votive offerings is also a religious tradition in many different cultures, whether that's in a river or at a tree. So again, there are many different reasons for it and many different ways of doing that. So leaving offerings for the fairies is an important part of the tradition. Like people would leave, for example, a drop of poitín or whiskey, or the first, the colostrum, the first milk from a cow after giving birth, I think.
Would be offered to
It's called the beastings, and it would traditionally be thrown in the air for the fairies.
There's an echo of a libation about that, which seems to be part of most cultures I've come across anyway. There's always the drop for the land, or the drop for Mother Earth, or the drop for the ancestors, or whatever it is. There's
also the kind of way of rationalising the customs and beliefs and practices and so on. And someone might rationalise that by saying, well, maybe you shouldn't drink that first milk, and that's why it's the tradition, or that you shouldn't eat fruit after a certain date because the puka or the fairies are supposed to spit on it or whatever. So
it's like the blackberries of Halloween. Once Halloween comes, you shouldn't eat your blackberries,
Yeah.
and of course they're probably rotten on the briar anyway.
Or that you should treat people nicely. That there's this moralistic side to the stories, that it's maybe a social thing, a moral code, that you should treat people well because you don't know if they're a fairy or not, and there's again many different kinds of ways of explaining why these things are there, and why people say it, why people do it.
Thank you so much to Dr. Jenny Butler for giving me a personal guided tour of fairy lore and landscapes, an exhibition she has curated at the Boole Library in University College Cork. The exhibition continues until June the 25th and is open to the general public. Just present yourself at reception inside the door of the library and they will let you in without a student card. For those who can't travel to Cork, there is a website, fairyloreandlandscapes.com, and also a Facebook page titled Fairy Lore and Landscapes Project. I played 2 traditional Irish tunes as incidental music tonight, The Butterfly by Mad Dog McCrae and 2 versions of The King of the Fairies, the first by Tofu Love Frog and the second by Leisha Kelly. Thank you for listening. Get up to the exhibition if you can. I'm Éanna Dowling. I'll be back with another Artefact show next week on Community Radio Youghal. Till then, take care. Bye bye. Ciao ciao. Slán.